In this video, we'll learn how to set Redshift as our render engine and just familiarize ourselves with Redshift's overall user interface and find out where all the related Redshift for Cinema 4D options are within Cinema 4D. In order to set Redshift as your render engine, you need to go to your render settings, and here using the render dropdown, you can choose Redshift to be your render engine. And that's it. Probably the first thing you want to configure when using Redshift as a GPU render engine is to define the GPU or GPUs that you want Redshift to use for rendering purposes. In order to do that, from the Edit menu, open up Preferences window and open up Redshift Preferences. Under the System section, we can pick and choose which GPUs we want Redshift to use. In this PC, I have an RTX 3070 and an RTX 2060 Super, and both of them are enabled, and therefore Redshift use both of them when we start rendering. If you want a specific GPU to not be used, simply disable it here. I think for these changes to take effect, you need to restart Cinema 4D. You also notice I'm using Redshift 3.0.50, and as we progress through the course, if a new version becomes available, I'll update and let you know. Now let's get back to the render settings window. When using Redshift as your render engine, you get two render settings modes, basic and advanced. In the basic mode, Redshift gives you the most essential settings that you need. You can control the quality of your render using this bucket quality settings from low to very high. If you want to have a cleaner render, you can simply go from low to medium to high and to very high. And as you do that, you get cleaner renders but with longer render times. You can enable denoising. It basically takes a noisy render and tries to clean it up very quickly without having to wait for longer renders. And denoising can happen in real time or after the render is finished depending on the rendering mode and the chosen denoising engine. You can enable motion blur here as well. Global illumination or indirect lighting can be enabled too. And finally, we have the ray depth settings to control how many times a specific ray type like reflection can bounce back and forth between the objects in the scene. In the advanced mode, you get the full treatment if you want to go deeper and have more control over specific render settings. Sampling tab is where you control the overall quality of your render. That's low to very high settings we saw in the basic tab. Here you will find a more complicated version of that. We'll learn all about them in the rendering section of the course. You can also check the denoising and texture sampling as well. Under motion blur, we can enable motion blur and adjust its settings. Under the global tab, we have our trace depth settings for different ray types. Under these other overrides, we can enable and disable certain functions and features globally. For example, if we don't want to see any reflections in the scene, we can simply disable reflections. Under the color management section, we can define the color space we want to work in. By default, it is set to OCIO and ACES CG, which is a dream come true really. We'll be working entirely in ACES for this course, but when learning about color management in the rendering section of the course, I'll show you how to get back to a more traditional linear color space. But ACES is so good when you start using it on a more daily basis, you simply can't go back to that limited linear space. Under the global illumination, you can enable global illumination or indirect lighting and choose your primary and secondary engine. These will be discussed in the global illumination section of the course. Under caustics tab, you can enable and adjust caustics. Then we have our AOVs. AOVs or arbitrary output variables is the term Redshift uses for multipass rendering. We'll learn everything we need to know about AOVs later on in the course. Optimization settings allow you to fine-tune some of the functions which you barely need to touch. Under the System tab resides some very important settings, especially under this memory section, and you basically can control how Redshift utilizes your GPUs. Under this log and feedback section, you can generate a log reporting all the steps needed to render an image, as well as any warnings and errors encountered by the renderer. You can find a bunch of other self-explanatory settings for bucket rendering and texture baking. We'll get back to these in due time. Now let's take a look at the Redshift menu. Here you can create different Redshift objects like volume, proxy, sun and sky, environment, and so on. You can add different redshift lights. You probably use area light and dome light more than the rest. You can also create different redshift cameras and materials. You have access to different utilities under this tools section. You can open up the Redshift render view window where you can render your scene interactively while you are still working on your scene lights and materials, or you can also take a final render as well. We spend a lot of time here in the course and we become more familiar with this window as we go through the course. There will be a specific video in the rendering section of the course to explain everything in the render view. Now back to the Redshift menu, we have the Assets Manager, which allows you to control and manage your scene textures in one convenient place. AOV Manager allows you to add and adjust your AOVs in a simple to manage window basically. You can access Redshift preferences right from here as well instead of the edit menu, and also we have a help menu. Now down here in the Material Manager, you can create different Redshift materials. You notice it's the same list we had access to in the Redshift menu. If we add an object here, anything, and right click on it in the object manager, you notice we have two specific Redshift tags, Redshift camera and Redshift object. Using Redshift camera tag, you can turn any normal Cinema 4D camera to a Redshift camera, which gives you some specific Redshift options on top of the usual Cinema 4D options. You can obviously create a Redshift camera directly from the Redshift menu, which is a normal Cinema 4D camera with a Redshift camera tag already applied to. But the object tag is used more often as it controls a lot of aspects of your objects in the scene like visibility, tessellation, displacement, matte settings, and so on. We'll be discussing these tags thoroughly later on. So in this lesson, we learned how to set Redshift as our render engine and where to find Redshift inside Cinema 4D. In the next lesson, we go through the overall workflow when working with Redshift for Cinema 4D. See you there.